Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to discuss this pressing and urgent matter in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Atlantic Council. This event is being co-hosted by the Enough Project, so I'd like to begin by thanking them for their cooperation, their hard work, and of course their intellectual contribution to today's event. For those of you who may be visiting us for the first time, the Africa Center was established in 2009 to promote dynamic geopolitical partnerships with African states and to redirect U.S. and African policy priorities towards strengthening security and promoting economic growth and prosperity on the continent. Central to the Africa Center's mission is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which today remains trapped in a tenuous political situation. President Joseph Kabila continues to refuse to step down following the constitutionally mandated expiration of his term in December of 2016. Earlier this month, the Roman Catholic Bishops' Conference, known commonly by the acronym CENCO, spearheaded a deal between members of Kabila's party and members of the opposition. The deal stipulates, among other things, that members of the opposition will be brought into the government and that the country will hold elections by the end of 2017. Indications that the deal will be respected and implemented, however, are not encouraging. Last week, Prime Minister Badi Banga, who would need to relinquish his post as Prime Minister in favor of a member of the opposition, rejected the terms of the agreement, which leaves the deal in a sort of limbo, and it's not clear at all what will happen if or perhaps when the deal collapses. This makes it a matter of pressing concern to the U.S. government. Both the Atlantic Council and the Enough Project have been warning of this impending political crisis for a number of months and have published a series of reports. The Atlantic Council briefs were Why the Congo Matters by our own senior fellow, Gerard Prunier, and Congo Blues, Scoring Kabila's Rule by our senior fellow, Pierre Engelbert, who will be joining us for our discussion. The Enough Project's The Century has also published a report on the scale and depth of kleptocracy and corruption in the Congo. All of these reports are situated just outside the door. I encourage you to grab them and read them. They're worthwhile. That's a self-interested pitch, but I promise you it's true. Today we'll be joined in a discussion with three outstanding experts on the conflict in the DRC. Dr. Pierre Engelbert, our senior fellow, who is the H. Russell Smith Professor of International Relations and Professor of Politics at Pomona College in California. Mr. Sasha Lezhnev, who is the Associate Director for Policy at the Enough Project, and an expert in peace, conflict, and corporate accountability issues in Central Africa. And of course, Dr. J. Peter Pham, the Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, and also Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives. We are going to hear brief remarks from each panelist before opening up to a general discussion, including questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite our panelists to join us on the stage.
Thank you.
Dr. Pham.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bronwyn, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us today. My brief is to maybe establish the context of how we got to where we are, and then turn it over to my colleagues here, first to Dr. Engelbert to discuss some of the institutional dynamics, and then to Sasha to talk about how we deal with some of our concerns at the moment. In many respects, where we are today, this was not a mystery or something that was unforeseen. I wrote a piece, an op-ed, at this point more than 3 years ago, with the title, "Third Time's Not a Charm," pointing out that actually the Congolese people have already spoken on this issue and spoken rather clearly and unambiguously in December 18th and 19th of 2005, when 84% of them voting in a referendum organized by, with the help of the United Nations and the international community, endorse the Constitution that is now the Constitution of this country. And the Constitution is very clear in its provision, specifically Article 220, that says that Article 220 in the Congolese Constitution is important because it comes after Articles 218 and 19. 218 and 19 lay out the procedure for amending the Constitution of the country, the various ways it can be done, at whose initiative, the procedural. Article 220, however, laid down that not subject to these procedures were several things: the republican nature of the state, the principle of universal suffrage, representative government, the independence of the judiciary, multi-party politics, and the number and duration of the mandates of the president. No more than 2 consecutive terms, full stop. And these cannot be changed. The French is absolutely clear on that. L'objet d'aucune révision constitutionnelle. So we all knew that come the end of 2016, there had to be a transition in power. We knew this several years ago when I wrote about third time not being a charm. We knew about it as an international community when repeatedly US officials, including Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State John Kerry, certainly Special Envoy Tom Perriello, our ambassador in the Democratic Republic of Congo until recently, and I just want to reiterate, but also our European partners, African leaders, et cetera. Everyone knew this was coming. And yet, elections were not organized. The so-called Independent National Electoral Commission did not receive adequate resources to carry out its work. And then to further complicate things, last year there was the decision made to split up the existing provinces, multiplying the provinces and adding to the number of jurisdictions and districts that needed to be taken care of. And so the calendar marched forward, everyone continuing to emphasize the need for elections, but no movement toward the organization of elections. Then we had the crackdown on a number of protests, sanctions imposed on 2 officials 6 months ago by the United States, and then following crackdown protests in September when the constitutional deadline for the Independent Electoral Commission to set the date of the election 3 months ahead of it passed without that the European Union issued sanctions on a number of additional individuals. And then, of course, we passed the date in November, no elections, and then, of course, the 19th of December came and went, and, of course, there was neither the leaving of the presidential office nor was invoked the constitutional provision, possibly for the President of the Senate to take over. And that teed us up for the furious round negotiations, which Bronwyn alluded to earlier, mediated by the Roman Catholic Bishops' Conference, CENCO, led by its president, Archbishop Utembi, and its vice president, Archbishop Ambongo, which led with an extension over the Christmas. It was supposed to end by Christmas Eve. The bishops then agreed to start it up again, and the New Year's Eve agreement, which to date the president has not himself signed, although it's been signed by persons purporting to represent him. And we'll discuss probably that agreement and perhaps some of the issues with it. But without further ado, let me turn over to Pierre.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Bronwyn. So a couple of points I'd like to highlight about the accord itself, and then I will let Sasha dig deeper into, I think, the dynamics of where we go from here. And then I want to make a couple of broader points about some more fundamental dimensions of politics in Congo that can help enlighten our understanding of the dynamics forward. The first one, regarding the accord itself, the devil is in the details. Right? So there is an agreement as of December 31st, but really, to some extent, there is no agreement either, because they let a lot of things to be negotiated later as part of what they call les arrangements particuliers, right? Particular arrangements. And that includes a lot of very significant dimensions, which they're negotiating about right now with CENCO, who might be running out of patience at some point. So this is certainly not a done deal. There's a big question of the appointment of the prime minister. Is it the prerogative of the opposition to just nominate somebody, and most probably Félix Tshisekedi, or is it up to the president to then choose from a group of potential candidates? As Bronwyn mentioned, what happens to Sami Badibanga, right? I mean, the president does not have the authority to dismiss the prime minister. So until now, the president always asked the prime minister to resign, and of course they've been together, so that's been a problem, but Badibanga might not want to go, in which case the only way to get him go is to get a vote of no confidence in parliament. The parliament is in extraordinary session now, I believe until Friday, and so I don't think it's going to happen by then, in which case you would have to call parliament back into extraordinary session, because there's not another one scheduled until March. And who calls them back? It's Aubin Minaku, who's, of course, in the presidential majority. So would he do that? Meanwhile, we're supposed to have elections by the end of this year, so you can imagine the kind of time problem that this brings about. So there's a lot that remains to be negotiated. There's a lot that's very confusing and very uncertain. I would like to make a couple of broader points. One is the issue of legitimacy. Going forward, where does political legitimacy come from? From the point of view of the opposition, it was very well explained by Martin Fayulu, who's a minor opposition candidate, but an important one in many ways. And he said, going forward, the legitimacy of the president, the legitimacy of the forthcoming government, and the legitimacy of the institutions of the republic derive from the agreement of December 31st. So essentially, it says the constitution is superseded, and we have this new dispensation. The presidential majority does not see it that way, and they believe that this is a political agreement, but that the constitution and the sovereignty of the state and the president remain the most important trump card. So you can imagine when there is some sort of conflict going forward, these two very different interpretations will clash, and my guess would be that push comes to shove, sovereignty wins the day. A few more points to make sense of where we are now. Congo is a very low trust society, and it's very hard to make sense of things if you don't bear that into account. There's low trust between the government and the opposition, of course. There's very low trust among the opposition themselves. So what looks like a united front, Nord de Rassemblement, is not a very stable arrangement. There's low trust among civil society organizations. There's low trust within the presidential majority too. Certainly people are hedging their bets. And to some extent, that's the low trust environment is part of what makes it so hard for President Kabila to step down, because nobody can credibly commit to him about any kind of future arrangement that would preserve his interest. So the fact that the regime has not built institutions is coming back to haunt him to some extent. Right? So it's something to bear in mind. Another important thing is uncertainty. So if you're hoping for clarification and certainty, you're in the wrong place. It's not going to happen. Whatever comes out of this, there's not going to be a lot of certainty. Remember, we had a dialogue back in October that produced some sort of agreement. By the way, that dialogue came after a massive national consultation the year before, which followed an earlier dialogue. I mean, there's been no deficit of dialogues and big debates and discussion in the margin of formal institutions in Congo, which shows the extent to which there's dysfunction within the formal system itself. So you had the first dialogue, which produced a government, actually. And then you have a second dialogue, which is trying to produce a government. So you might end up with two governments, which reminds me of the National Sovereign Conference with Birindwa and guess who? It was already a Tshisekedi at the time. So this kind of confusion is actually fairly standard in Congolese politics, right? So now you have an agreement in December, but that agreement is not really an agreement yet, because the agreement includes the fact that we're going to negotiate further parts of the agreement, which are being negotiated right now. So who's the government? Right? What is the value of rules and laws? How does the agreement stand compared to the constitution? What would be the validity of decisions taken by the current government, the previous government, the next government? How do things get implemented? What will this government be able to do over the next year? Right? So I can tell you that one thing I'm very confident about is that uncertainty is not going away, and this kind of very blurred environment will continue to prevail. And my last point is this, that I think that for the first time, probably since 2001, at least since 2006, we are in a situation where the constitutional dispensation, the rules of the country, do not match the strategy of power consolidation of the regime. So until now, you've had a regime under Joseph Kabila and his group that has been trying to consolidate power. They've been able to do that through a transition, through a period of post-conflict reconstruction, and through the new constitution of 2006. Now we're at the end of what this constitution allows them to do, and so we are at a period where there's a contradiction between the legal system and the goals, the likely goals of a regime that's trying to, in the long run, consolidate its foundations. And so one has to give. So over the coming year, we'll find out which one it is, but I think that it's the first time since Joseph Kabila has taken power that we are in this situation, and I think it's momentous. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Peter and Bronwyn and Kelsey and everyone at the Atlantic Council for organizing and hosting this event here. It's an honor to speak here. I would before I get to sort of the way forward, I just wanted to say a quick word to mark the importance of this accord that was, in fact, signed. I mean, the government did commit to hold elections at the end of this year and to not hold a referendum to decide the constitutional question. I think that, you know, in looking back, it is a clear demonstration that negotiations that do have a mediator that has the confidence of both parties, that are backed by strong leverage. And Peter mentioned the sanctions by the United States and European Union, very important. The pressure from Angola, the very important pressure from Congress in two resolutions that passed, as well as various investigations, including those of the century, that I think provided some important leverage to this accord. And also I'd like to thank Tom Perriello and Ambassador Swan for their leadership in helping facilitate this process, as well as, of course, the leaders in the Catholic bishops. That said, as we wrote in our comprehensive study last year, Criminal State, Congo has been run in various ways as a violent kleptocracy for the last 130 years, in which ruling networks and commercial partners have hijacked governing institutions for the purpose of resource extraction and security of the regime. They let security forces pay themselves, they've personally profited from natural resource deals, and they've maintained impunity for regime-connected elites. And so one piece of paper that the president did not sign is not really going to change that entire process. And so I think that it's important to look now at what, in fact, the key terms that were agreed to in that important accord, and really focus on making sure that those key benchmarks in those important agreements are in fact implemented in a time-bound manner. I believe the United States and European countries and the entire international community should follow Congolese civil society's lead in holding the parties, particularly the Congolese government, to account for a couple of key benchmarks. I would highlight 5 in particular. So number 1, and I believe this should be the priority, is really finding a date and a realistic timetable for the holding of these elections in 2017. That is the real priority. I think Congolese civil society that we speak to is already very frustrated with the process, and if by sometime in February there's not a strong commitment to, in fact, hold these elections on time, then you'll see an escalation of pressure from them. Number 2 is to fully establish this oversight committee that was written out into the accord with very clearly defined roles. Etienne Tshisekedi is supposed to chair this this oversight committee, but what exact powers will he have, given the discrepancies that Pierre highlighted between the agreement and the Constitution, or constitutional process? Number 3 is establishing a date for the handover of the Prime Minister. The Rassemblement, the opposition, has picked their candidate, but there's no timetable for the handover. In fact, numerous people have said that there's questions as to whether this handover will happen and, in fact, install a new transitional government. Number 4 is to drop the charges against political prisoners and resolve those outstanding cases. There remain a number of prisoners, 9 from Lucha and Filimbi, that remain in prison today, and those that have been let go, their charges are still pending. The new Interior Minister, Shadari, has commented that they will work to resolve this issue, but here we are, almost 3 weeks after the signing of this accord, and there's been no progress as of yet. And the 5th benchmark I would highlight would be the restoration of the independent media. There were 6 Congolese independent media stations that were shut down, as well as Radio France International. Those have not yet been restored. Those are supposed to be confidence-building measures in the accord, and yet, as Pierre highlighted, there's no confidence being built. I would also just highlight 2 things that are not necessarily written into the accord, but that will be very important for increasing the confidence of the international community and civil society in the process. Number 1 is the transparency of the electoral process itself. So, what are going to be the rules of the campaigning? Will the government stick by them in terms of political prisoners, et cetera? The monitoring role of the committee and conducting an external audit. I think that those are very important and possible reconfiguration of the electoral body. The second issue is not an immediate priority, but a very important one, given what we've seen in terms of the corruption that's been happening. The state-owned enterprises in Congo are quite frankly, been very problematic in terms of suspicious transactions being used by members of the regime to conduct various nefarious activities. And so we would call for those key state-owned enterprises. I would highlight Jacamines and Sokimo as 2 enterprises that should undergo third-party audits and make those audits publicly accessible. We saw just yesterday that Jacamines is conducting another undisclosed transactions worth quite a number of $1 million. So, what can the U.S. and European Union do now? I think it's very important that they use policy tools and to create leverage for accountability and for this democratic transition process. So, number 1, in something that has not been used very much is anti-money laundering tools. So the Congolese officials and their commercial networks are still using US dollars and the international financial system for their transactions. And so there's a number of steps that the US Treasury Department, through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, as well as European financial intelligence units can take. Private steps to demand vigilance from banks, various advisories which highlight patterns of corruption and possible use of the U.S. Patriot Act in terms of designated certain banks or certain transactions or certain individuals as jurisdictions of primary money laundering concern. Number 2, if the government does not stick by the terms of the agreement, I believe that higher level targeted sanctions should be employed against top financial advisors, commercial partners, and possible even, people that fit into both of those categories that also happen to be members of Joseph Kabila's family. Number 3, I believe that steps of accountability are very important. The FCPA case that relates to Congo continues today, and I believe there should be indictments issued for that. That's the Oxif case. As well as targeting the facilitators of violence. Of course, there are a number of armed groups out there, but the Congolese army officials and units that work with them directly and have profited from their illicit natural resource extraction have not been targeted in legal cases. And then lastly, I would highlight various governance and accountability, transparency measures such as independent audits, strengthening EITI process, and reforming aid programs further to make sure that full accountability measures are built into the programs. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Well, since you've opened the topic of policy prescriptions, let me, if I can, invite Dr. Pham and Dr. Engelbert to comment on your recommendations or perhaps add on. What should the U.S. be doing to assist in this transition to encourage Kabila to step down or Badi Banga to step down? Pierre.
Okay, so I think that what the U.S. can do is a function of what the U.S. wants to achieve. if what we want is to actually have Kabila step down, then I certainly think that the kind of sanctions, the kind of pressure that Sasha has highlighted, I think have been fairly significant and have had some significant impact. Sanctions, asset freezing of his entourage. I would also say work with Angola. There's always an issue of legitimacy of outsiders' intervention, but Angola is certainly an important godfather of the regime, which is concerned about the potential for instability. And I would imagine that we can, they've already signaled some interest in moving forward. But the question is, if this is what we want, then who do we replace him with? I mean, we have to be careful what we're wishing for. Jean-Claude Kabila, his little brother, just set up a political party last week. And so God knows, right? If we just want elections and without, any kind of outcome, specific outcome, I don't see it possible without us paying for them, and actually without literally organizing them to a certain extent. Maybe through MONUSCO like we did in 2006. I don't think it's going to happen otherwise. So there's almost like a trusteeship system needed here. If what we want is to avoid violence, then I also think the kind of sanctions that we've had in place, that the EU also has had, I think helped to some extent. That's with violence from the regime, but you have to bear in mind that there's potential violence from the opposition too, and so we have to keep them invested in a process of negotiation to avoid this. If what we want is stability in the region, then that's completely different. You might want to let this regime consolidate, because then if what you really care about is not having more bloodshed, then there's something to be said for that. I'm not making a normative argument. I'm trying to make an analytical one. If what you want is more accountability of governance, then I think it might be a good idea to push for further decentralization, for further effective decentralization, for these reforms to be carried through, because they've really been sabotaged until now. But there's room there for a kind of governance that would be more responsive to the needs of citizens. So those are kind of different objectives with different kind of recommendations.
I would agree with everything that Sacha and Pierre have said, but I think what we need to do is have a menu of options, and including the option to ratchet things up. Sacha mentioned, I think, very probably the sanctions that are currently there, potential future sanctions, and I think that I would take it even one step further to beyond the option on the table of sanctions against members of the family and others, to include travel bans, and then beyond which, as Pierre mentioned earlier, the legitimacy in many respects of the government hinges upon this political accord, because December 19th has come and gone a month ago. And so if this accord is dead or is allowed to wither, then the question, I think it should be an open one and a policy option, not saying that it should be taken immediately, on the table is whether we continue to recognize Joseph Kabila as anything other than a squatter at the Palais des Nations. And do we recognize him as the government of the country? Should be on the table, which would have consequences, at least for FCPA and the Bribery Act, of transfer payments made to the government by outside companies. Again, this is in an arc of things. It's certainly not the first where you go, but these are things that should be considered and be instruments, tools of statecraft to add leverage to the situation so that, God willing, the agreement that the bishops help mediate is the way forward toward elections. But I think there should be a menu of options ratcheting things up and increasing the pressure, because it's in the interest of the international community and certainly in interests of Congo's neighbors in the area that the situation not explode. And I think the collapse of the agreement or the failure to hold elections this year opens up a can of worms that we don't want to go into.
Absolutely. I would like to point out that at the Atlantic Council, we do not take institutional positions, although our experts have strong views on various subjects. And at the Africa Center, we have hosted both key members of the opposition, such as Moise Katumbi, but also senior representatives of the government. We've taken pains to provide a platform for them to make their case as well. In the spirit of even-handedness, we're going to turn over to the audience for questions from you. I'd like to request that you refrain from commentary and make sure that you are asking a question as opposed to presenting a personal point of view. Would anyone like to kick us off?
Thank you, Bron.
Absolutely.
My name is Ed Stewart from Prison Brew. Question is for, thank you. President, questions for any of you all. The opposition, their behavior during the negotiations of the agreement, how do you all feel that that then bodes for them unifying, further splitting, consolidating? They're obviously a very dynamic group, but how was their behavior during the negotiations? How does it bode for a potential election season? Thank you.
Anyone want to grab that?
Sasha?
Okay.
Are we going to take multiple or one at a time?
I usually one at a time.
Oh, okay. If you want to.
Yeah, you know, the opposition is, I think, fundamentally divided. So there's an agreement now, there's a rassemblement, so a rally of the opposition. I do think they benefit from the negotiation because, you know, this gives them a chance to make sure that elections, or it gives them a chance that elections might take place. It gives them a chance that there would be no referendum to change the constitution. So those are very important things that keep them together. But also it gives them a chance to partake in participating in government and have access to resources. So when it comes to that, I think they're less likely to be united. When it comes to the actual getting close to the election, I think that it's a rassemblement now, but the UDPS would have, certainly I cannot imagine the UDPS not backing somebody from within UDPS or from the same family. And then I imagine the G7 would rally behind Katumbi, Kamere would be for Kamere, and everybody else would be for getting something. So I think the potential for division is high.
Yeah, I would just add that, Congolese politics is very complicated, which always makes it a very interesting country to work on. But I think their opposition displayed a remarkable amount of unity in the negotiations and in the lead up to the accord, given all the tensions and, of course, the attempts to buy off individual members. I think the Kamere sort of signing early of this October agreement was a little premature, and folks may turn against him. Let's see. But I agree with what Pierre said. I think that as we get closer, if we indeed get closer to an actual electoral process, that may change a bit. That said, if you look at Jason Stern's the Congo Research Group poll, there were some pretty clear leaders in that poll, and so Katumbi's fate in this whole process, which is to be negotiated by the bishops, is an important, very, very important factor going forward.
In fact, taking up on that point, I would say actually the opposition displayed a remarkable degree of statesman-like behavior during the negotiations, giving ground on I think two key points. One was the fact that Katumbi's fate was not settled and in the accord, when that he could have held out, given the level of support he had. The demanded that be settled in the accord, which probably would have scuttled the accord. There would not have been an accord. So allowing that to be mediated later by the bishops, and in fact, as he gave an interview saying he placed his fate in the hands of the bishops. The other point to the opposition, it was a political risk. It's December 19th was the end of the president's mandate. The 20th was a clear thing. It's black and white. It's very easy to mobilize people over something that's black and white. They had the momentum. To mobilize people over technical, even of substantive violations of this lengthy accord, it's kind of hard. You can't get that into a soundbite. That someone is in violation of Section 4, Paragraph 2, Subarticle 2. It's not going to get so I would say the opposition, both sides gave ground. But I think the opposition displayed a bit of statesman-like behavior, which I think is to be commended.
Excellent. Absolutely. Okay.
Just wait for the mic.
Good morning. My name is Marie-Claire Gonda. I'm running for office in the DRC as a candidate for Congress in the Bas-Congo. And my question has to do with the lack of representation of the women in any of the talk, in any of the dialogue, actually in anything that has to do with the decision-making of this country, of the Congo. So I would like to know is there is there a specific reason why we are not addressing that part? And I don't understand the part of addressing just the men view and dismissing, for me, as I see it, the women position. And when you look at the way things are happening, they're all fighting for positions. But I think the only person who dismissed the position or being anybody in the leadership of the political arena is a woman, Eva. Which she did not ask to have a position, but she's making sure that we can have a process that will lead to this election. So my question goes to why we don't see more women, why we don't hear, why we don't include more women in all those dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to our 3 male panelists and ask them what they think about that.
I think Congo is a very patriarchal society. I think that politics is men control politics more than in many other places. I wish you good luck running for, if you have elections,
Absolutely.
running for the National Assembly. Yeah. So I think there's a very small representation of women as it stands now. There's a big issue with politics in Congo is that, like as in many other developing countries, that there's a dimension of patronage, which means that you need to accumulate resources to redistribute them, which then when the system is biased towards men, it's a hard thing for women to accumulate the kind of assets that put you in a position to compete like that. Now, this being said, I don't think Eva Zaimba is that different the way she behaves. She's essentially asking for better participation in this transition agreement like any other political party. I don't know that the MLC would have a different position if it was not represented by a woman at this point. So I think it's a very important structural weakness, which is not at all uncommon in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. So my sense is, again, when I listen to you, women are dismissed from the process because I don't hear anything really which will address that part. And I was there on September 19th, just a quick remark. And what I saw is we were prevented from going to work. Our kids were prevented from going to school because we are hoping on people who disagree all the time, who fight all the time, who cannot make sure that this process is going to work for all of us. So that's my question is, how do we make sure that this happens? So we women want this peace. We want this process to happen. We want election to happen. We want to have a stable country. We want to send our kids to school. We want to work. So why aren't our voice being represented in this process?
You make very fair and I think very just demands. And my only response to that is the key is organize yourself. Many of these parts, and this does not apply only to the Democratic Republic of Congo, but throughout most of Africa. Political parties may have the name Democratic, Progressive, and other adjectives in their name, but in reality, their own internal governance structures are neither democratic nor progressive. And I think part of it is they are structures used by individuals. And so my challenge to civil society is to organize new political structures, new parties that are democratic, that elect their leaders and choose their leaders instead of leaders by hereditary succession or some other that are vehicles for the ambitions of one or two people. So I think one of the reasons I think there were not as many women in the process, and maybe that's wrong, is that the number of Congolese, I can only think of 2 or maybe 3 at most, major political organizations that are legally registered that are actually have a woman as, the legal representative or head. So maybe it's time if you can't get ahead in the existing organizations, it might be time to, and I realize it's difficult for different reasons, but to organize new structures.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with your comment. I think that was a major problem with the negotiations. We ourselves at Enough have been trying to encourage some women leaders in Eastern Congo to step up and run for political office. There have been many prominent civil society leaders. In fact, one of the women civil society leaders of Lucha was arrested in the days around December 19th, and so there was another problem. So yeah, I mean, I do wish you all the best in your political campaign. I think that I do know that some of the envoys did speak extensively with women groups, women leaders, other civil society groups in those. Maybe they were not at the table, but many of their views were attempted to be incorporated into that. I know when we traveled with Special Envoy Perriello, that he was very keen on meeting women leaders across the country to try to involve them in the talks. So I would certainly hope that that would be ramped up this year.
Hi, I'm Nick Hanlon from the Center for Security Policy. I just want to invite the panelists to include more on the East and the implications for these things in the Kivus. I don't know if it's efficient to categorize it both politically and then also who the main beneficiaries are for mineral extraction, mainly more to Sasha on that, but also what the dynamics are. I know Kabila got over 90% of the vote in 2011. It's very hard to find somebody over there who'll say something nice about him, so if you could just speak to that contradiction.
I mean, we're very concerned with the security situation in Eastern Congo. One of the tactics we expect that may be used is the declaration of a national emergency, and therefore would nullify any political discussions or the holding of elections this year, et cetera. We're very concerned about these new reports of M23 fighters possibly coming in and reorganizing. Certainly in the lead up to December 19th and a couple of days after that, we saw different militia attacks. Of course, the various groups have documented what's been happening in Beni, not with the Congolese army officers tied to allowing ADF remnants to attack or contributing to the instability there strongly. So I think that if the implementation does indeed go badly, that there are various political leaders who would start to use more militias. We heard of a new militia coming up this week. So we're quite concerned. Quite concerned about that. So I think that would be a serious implication of poor politics.
Let me ask you, since you've raised this, Sasha, I mean, what do you think the fate of the accord is going to be? Will it last? Or do you think that it will simply collapse before its year has expired?
I personally think that without serious leverage and pressure, I don't see that the parties, particularly the government, have a strong will to implement it yet. I think they're seeing some sort of a vacuum in attention, and like Peter said, that there's not a black and white December 19th date, that people are not going to rally behind paragraph 2, section 3, and there's a gap in administration, so they're trying to play that out. So I think that's going to be critical to keep it going. I don't know what the other you will say.
I think also that short of significant outside pressure, including the kind of ratcheting up that Peter mentioned, I think that intrinsically the dynamics of the accord lean towards failure of implementation, if not even at the conclusion level. And if that happens, I imagine that it would be something that drags on over a few months with the kind of uncertainty I was highlighting earlier. And then eventually gets this kind of rotten situation where you cannot exclude some more dramatic development, including the decision to go to a referendum on the part of the incumbents, or something potential of a coup from people within the regime who might be favoring other dynamics. So certainly, personally, I'm not as concerned about the possibility of return to large-scale violence. And I think the connections with the East are there. They're indirect largely, but I could be wrong about that, but I don't see that as strongly. But certainly, I imagine the possibility of a radical change in Kinshasa is not to be discounted.
I would, I preface this by saying I very much hope, it's my hope, my prayer, that the accord does what it's supposed to do, that Congo enjoys for the first time in its history a constitutional transition the way it should be done. That being said, I also didn't fall off the turnip truck on the way here to the Atlantic Council this morning, and I find it very hard, it strains credulity to expect that the that Joseph Kabila would actually, if he had read the accord, would actually implement it. Let me cite just a couple examples. The accord is very clear that the prime minister who shall be presented by the opposition, that was not part of the October 18th previous mini accord with when the government bought off some members of the opposition. So we're talking about the Rassemblement. They will present that prime minister will exercise in the accord the fullness of the plenitude, the fullness of the prerogatives given to the prime minister in the Constitution as chief of government. Go back and read the Constitution of the RC, the same Constitution that the voters of the country approved by 84% back in December of 2005. Let me just cite two powers that are very limiting to the president if the prime minister actually exercised them. Article 81 of the Congolese Constitution says the president may only nominate as officials, and it goes through the whole ranks, military, police, security, civil service, etc., upon the proposal of the prime minister and the council of ministers. He can only nominate them if they're proposed. So patronage out the window. Same article. The president's acts must be countersigned by the prime minister to be legally valid. His ability to do anything if the new prime minister doesn't sign. Same with now, up to now, the prime minister's been very compliant and they sign what they're handed to them. Article 91, it is the prerogative of the prime minister and the government to define, in coordination with the president, but the prerogative of the prime, the policy of the nation. Essentially, if the accord enters into full force, and we take it at the text as a legal text and the new legitimacy, essentially we have a fairly strong guarantee that elections, the momentum shifts to the prime minister and the cabinet, elections are held, and legally speaking, the president becomes Queen Elizabeth minus the pomp and the circumstance. Now, could that happen? Do miracles happen? Possibly. Although, my grandmother always told me to pray as if everything depended on God, but work as if they depended on you. So I place a lot more faith in the concrete and the tangible. So I leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you. Let me get someone in the back corner of this room. Thank you. Right here.
Good morning. My question goes to, one of the panelists suggested some options for sanctioning the leaders in that particular country. So my question is, in case you have to be concerned about auditing these particular leaders, are you going to start from individuals or family members, or the institutions that are currently, financial institutions that are currently in that country that support this particular government? And in terms of multinational corporations that have benefits from this particular government, are those sanctions and audit processes going to be extended to those corporations as well?
And I think in the interest of time, we'll take two more questions, if that's okay. Hi, Alexis.
Thanks, Alexis Arieff with the Congressional Research Service. I wonder if the panelists could could shed some light on the situation in the Kasai region, which finally sort of made it into the public view in a major way with UN OCHA's statements last week about a budding humanitarian crisis. Is what we're seeing a new form of insurgency? And either way, what is the link, if any, between what's happening in the Kasais and what's happening in Kinshasa?
Excellent. Is there anyone else who'd like to add on? Ma'am? And could you introduce yourself too, please? Thank you. And I'm so sorry. There
Sorry,
you go.
Maria De Cruz, U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for the great presentation. Most of the panelists mentioned Angola at some point in their presentation. I'd like to hear from you what you feel that Angola could do more in order to assist with the conflict. And do you feel that the elections in Angola taking place this August will have effect on resolving the issue in Congo?
Okay, excellent. And I'll ask Peter to kick us off this time.
Okay. The question with regard, I'll defer the question on the specific questions on sanctions to investigations to, I think Sasha and Enough has done a great deal of work, and especially some of the investigative. So I'll defer that to, I think Angola's played a very helpful role, I think, now in this crisis. Angola knows the Congo well. It's been engaged, and it has been both a bulwark of stability in the region as well as an important partner. And and I know Foreign Minister Chakotay in particular has been very, very actively engaged, and that's been, I think, by all accounts, and very, very helpful. Obviously, with the prospect of elections in Angola and the transition there in August, if everything goes as has been announced, two things. One would be President Dos Santos stepping aside would itself send a signal, a very powerful signal. One of Africa's longer-serving heads of state stepping aside voluntarily, I think, sends a very powerful signal, most of all to his next-door neighbor. On the other hand, there is a risk in Angola going through the transition. That would be a good example. On the other hand, that means Angola's political leaders will be inward turned toward their own succession, understandably. And so one can hope that that doesn't mean disengagement, because I think Angolan pressure has been very helpful to date. To Alexis's question about what's going on in Kasai, I think what we're seeing, I don't think we have enough visibility to fully unpack it, but I think in the best interpretation is that obviously when things are questionable or the stability is shaky at the center, all sorts of people will try to test boundaries, et cetera. That's probably the most benign interpretation of it. I think there are others out there. There certainly Congolese are not shy about voicing theory. There are all sorts of theories out there on the web and other places about perhaps nefarious actors in Kinshasa trying to get leverage by stirring things up. Again, not being on the ground, I can't speak to that, but given the country's history, which I think Pierre talked to, that would not be the first time someone has done something like that. So I think the answer is somewhere between the most benign, which is still not good, and more malevolent possibilities, not to be precluded, prima facie.
Anything I know about Angola, I know from Peter, so I will not add anything to that. But let me say something about Kasai. I'm lucky that one of my former students actually based there, and she's been sending me emails, and I've been able to follow up a little bit. I agree with Peter that there certainly is potential for manipulation and for Kinshasa politics to be expressed locally. But I also think that, see, what happened is that back in August, a chief was killed by security force, and his militia, a militia associated with him has been on a rampage since then. And certainly there's a lot of that's about banditry and about manipulation of politics. But there's also a degree of alienation and despair that makes this possible, that makes people likely to mobilize like this. And if you look at the Kasai is this diamond region that, both former Kasais, now they are split in multiple provinces, but this is a region that had really incredible wealth potential, and the misery there is overwhelming. As you also know, it's largely UDPS sensibilities there locally, but really an administration you can almost associate as an administration of occupation, and really highly repressive. I spent some time in the other Kasai in Bujima a couple of years ago, and I was overwhelmed by that. So there's a huge degree of despair and alienation. Poverty is very high. We hear about the East, but malnutrition is very high in the Kasais. Poverty, really, human conditions are really dreadful. So that feeds this kind of insurgency. It reminds me a little bit, the dynamics are different, but it's not that different from the Enyele insurgency in Equateur a few years ago, which were groups fighting over access to fishing ponds. I mean, this gives you an idea of the level of desperation when people fight over access to fishing. And also, remember Bududia Congo in Congo Central. There's also a group there where people find a different source of legitimacy. Chiefs are important. Chiefs provide meaning to people. They provide governance. They provide legitimacy. And when those are pushed back and the government does not give you much else, there's a situation of desperation that kind of feeds into this type of violence. So it's kind of a macro level of analysis, but that's where I would look to make sense of it.
Just to touch briefly on the sanctions question, I think there are four main categories of individuals that could be the next targets for smart sanctions. So, the military was one that was very much highlighted last year. I think that's another potential as human rights abuses and repression, if they do continue. Let me just start out actually by saying that I hope that there's not a need for these things. I do hope that, in fact, the parties are able to successfully negotiate these things and we are able to achieve a peaceful, non-leveraged or pressurized situation and agreement. In any case, the other three categories are financial, political, and the family members. I agree with what Peter said in terms of ratcheting up over time as needed, as necessary. I also don't think that the focus should be all on Congolese actors. There are some very influential outsiders. We've all noted the FCPA case where $100 million worth of bribes were paid. Well, those bribes were paid not by Congolese. They were paid by outsiders. And so I think that there can be an escalation of strategies. Those state-owned enterprises we talked about earlier, they have chairmen and directors. I don't think it would be necessarily helpful to sanction a particular entity because they could always set up another entity with different directors and so forth. But some of those powerful financial advisors who are well known, if I mentioned names today, no one would be greatly surprised. The Congo is a country that has received a lot of attention, and the Bloomberg investigation, the New York Times investigation have showed that there's a number of people out there who would be possibly targeted and who are using the international financial system. So they're using our own currencies and our own banks to transfer that money, and so there's action to be taken on the banks as well. Thanks.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
We are
And can you introduce yourself?
Dan Silverstein, Heuristic Management. We're processing a new world order in leadership at the United Nations and donor nations and sub-Saharan Africa. How do you suspect it will influence what's going on in the DRC?
Okay, thank you. And Tony, Tony Gambino, the former USA director in Kinshasa.
Thank you very much. We can think of the Congo sometimes at three different levels. You've been talking about it mainly at one level, these discussions among the political class. But frankly, those sometimes float disembodied away from the rest of the reality of the Congo. As we just heard in what you were talking about, Pierre, about the widespread poverty that's unfortunately characterized not just the Kasais, but most of the Congo for a long time. But I'd like to ask you about the middle level, which is kind of making sure that economically the country doesn't collapse and can somehow muddle through. We had a period over the last few years under the prime ministership of Matata Ponyo, where at least he had some credibility in the international community and could talk with the international financial institutions and others to keep things together. That's gone. This new government under Sami Badibanga, as best as I can tell, doesn't have anybody credible to do any economic management from the prime minister on down. Yet many people comment that a major financial crisis is coming in the Congo within the next few months. The IMF and others are speaking about this quite openly in Kinshasa and elsewhere. How do you see that affecting everything else you've been talking about in terms of if the economy really does crack sometime in whatever period, how might that affect everything else that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have to call on one of you?
I can certainly take Mr. Gambino's question.
Thanks, Pierre.
Yeah. You know, the Matata government I think the Matata government had a credibility that exceeded what it deserved to some extent. And it certainly looked like, I mean, he was a technocrat and he had, of course, a fairly successful stint as Minister of Finance, and they carried that with him. And he did something like bancarization, and there was some degree of macroeconomic stability. But bear in mind, the Congolese franc depreciated still under him, went from 980 to about 1300 to the dollar. Of course, part of that is because the dollar has been strengthening so much, but still. The budget, you know, last year they had to revise the budget, so they went from like an $8 billion budget to $6 billion mid-year through the fiscal year, realizing they're not going to get the revenue they were hoping for. So I agree with you that there's a significant danger of an economic crisis there. Matata might not have been all he was built up to be, but I agree with you that even if we have people who are competent in a Badibanga or Tshisekedi government, it's very unlikely that anybody will be able to do too much. And so if copper prices, they've recovered to some extent, but if the situation remains what it is, with China slowing down, then I think that you point to something significant, that it will not facilitate things. Yeah. I don't really have much more to contribute to that, except to know that you make a fine point that this is a significant risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fate of the economic crisis in Congo really rests with the government. I mean, you know, we, at the same time that this crisis was deteriorating and the currency was deteriorating, inflation was rising, the prices for basic commodities on the streets were rising, in some cases up to 50% for certain food items. The government there was millions, tens of millions that was going missing, right? So we, with the New York Times, helped document $95.7 million that went missing from Checkamines, $8 million of which was transferred in cash. And disappeared. So, you know, there was a new agreement signed with Freeport yesterday, undisclosed amount, but I'm sure it wasn't, you know, $100. So, where is that money going to go? You know, what is going to happen to that? You know, I do credit Matata for, you know, organizing these troika meetings very regularly and publishing the minutes, so everyone knew exactly how many reserves they were left, and so we could all track that, in fact, they were dwindling week by week. I haven't seen that from Badibanga, so at least they were on top of monitoring the situation. But you know, the IMF has been trying to get in with a program for years, and the Congolese government, frankly, has said, well, we are not interested. And so then they came asking for $500 million abruptly last year from the World Bank, but there's not enough governance transparency, and there's always political crisis as well, and mismanagement of of various things from transparency, non-publication of contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So I really do think that this crisis is resolvable. Some of the commodity prices have actually come back. Cobalt has also gone up a bit. Oil has obviously gone up. So I think it's manageable. But if they do not manage it correctly, yes, it will be much worse, and you'd see many more people in the streets, not just for the political issues.
Let me briefly revisit my answer based on what you said. I think that you add some important points. Matata, I mean, there were some achievements there. There's no doubt. Some degree of transparency was there. He was always unable to establish control over Gécamines, for example, over these parallel accounts, over the Ministry of Portfolio that really is much more under the authority of the president. And that has been a big weakness. I mean, he complained about that himself. It's like, I don't have that authority. I can't go after these people. And so if the management of natural resource was more transparent, if the amount of leakage that takes place there was harnessed in, then I think Congo does have the fiscal resources to weather a storm. But we're not there, and certainly I don't see a big, all-encompassing government having the kind of capacity to get that done in the coming year.
I would only add, two, maybe 3 points. One is, as Sasha mentioned, we have not had that accounting from the government. And we certainly have not had the type of regular reporting from the central bank we had when Jean-Claude was running it. Whatever one may think of the man, he kept things, he's got a set of books that one could look at. So we don't have visibility, but by best accounts, I think most estimates are that in the last 2 years they've burned through at least half, if not more, of the foreign reserve. It's gone. We have anecdotal evidence right now of not only civil servants not being paid, but dangerously military units not being paid. So again, we don't know, are they just saving for the storm that's coming, or is it empty? We don't know. We don't have anything close to that visibility. We haven't had for months. But I add is that if we compound a political crisis, the failure or collapse of the agreement, with an economic crisis, that is a perfect storm, and that's something to be worried about. But whether we can, it's very difficult to make that forecast because, in fact, we don't the type of visibility that we once had to a certain measure we no longer have.
Yeah, absolutely. We are nearing the end of our time, unfortunately, so I'm going to ask the panelists if you have any final remarks or wanted to add on anything that hadn't been raised in the discussion so far.
I think that we're at a new crossroads with the new administration. I think that there's a number of new opportunities. I would hope that the special envoy position would continue, and I think that it's good that we're having a sober assessment right now of what's likely to occur, and not just celebrating a piece of paper. And so I think that this is an important moment to look forward and plan some of those policy steps.
Excellent.
I think that I agree with what my colleagues here said and about the. I share some hope that with significant support, pressure, things might go forward. I do want to put a couple of maybe dampers at the end, saying that by and large we have to bear in mind that the odds of a peaceful and uncontroversial elections are low in any kind of scenario. This is not how elections really take place in Congo, and then since it would be not an easy one like we had in 2011, which already was controversial, I think that we have to be realistic about what we hope to achieve. So this is likely to be difficult and chaotic. I also think that we have to be honest that the odds of sustainable democracy in Congo are not very high for the short to medium term. Because of the low trust environment, because of the resource issues, because political parties remain really very personalized, many of the structural conditions for democracy really are not met yet. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't all push and help the Congolese who want to get there. There certainly is a lot of democratic aspiration, but the material necessities for democracy are really lacking, and so we should be reasonable about what we can hope to see.
I would just conclude with saying we are at as my boss here at the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, likes to say, an inflection point. And it's a very important one, and it's one which, given the dynamics outside Congo, it's important that, and I make this appeal to Congolese civil society and other friends of Congo, to maintain the vigilance and keep the international community, because the international community is going to be, the dynamics are going to, in a way, involuntarily force it to take the eye off the ball in a critical period. We have a political transition here in the United States. A new president, not only a new president coming in, but that means a whole new administration. Special Envoy Perriello left his job on the 23rd of December. Of course, I know he's now running for governor of Virginia. And that position is being, there's a caretaker administration of that office, but the new administration will have to decide whether the office continues or not, who staffs out the front office of the Africa Bureau, all those other questions. France, another major partner, is in the middle of its own electoral season. The first round of the leftist primaries is this weekend. So another country in transition as well. So in the midst of all this transition, it's very easy, without the voice of civil society and others, for things to slip, and then all of a sudden we wake up mid-year, and then the cry will be, it's impossible to organize elections in 6 months. Well, we know now we're supposed to do it in 1 year, not 6 months. So it's that type of slippage that has unfortunately bedeviled Congo the last few years. And so I call on the advocacy community, civil society, to help keep policymakers focus on this.
Excellent. I want to thank everyone for coming today for this discussion, and we hope to see you again soon.